Joey Bizinger has been one of the most charismatic figures for the anime community in the West. Nowadays, he hasn't made much anime content as he used before, but it's definitely one of the OGs who influenced many weebs when anime started to be more and more popular.
In the anime community and the anime community have started calling me like one of the OGs, which is very flattering.
I think what impresses many people about him is not just that he knows about anime and talks about it, but he does speak Japanese so well, or rather I should say extremely well, which means he's perfectly fluent without any awkward accent, and exactly sounds like a native Japanese. So at least from a linguistic standpoint, this guy would be totally qualified to be Japanese, even more than average one.
まずうますぎるとかじゃなくて、もう俺よりうまい。
A lot of people don't know this, but Joey's Japanese is better than most Japanese people.
Why your Japanese is so good?
My Japanese is good because I studied for 28 years. The first words that ever came out of my mouth as a child were in Japanese.
Oh.
So technically speaking, my first language is Japanese. Even Japanese people don't know Japanese.
I think that's definitely true. Japanese language can be quite difficult, even for native Japanese like me, to use it correctly, especially when it comes to kanji or formal Japanese like Sonkeigo or Kenjougo, but he knows it a lot.
When I've said like, I've studied my entire life, like I'm not joking, I've studied my entire life.
But despite of the high language skill, this is how Japanese people often treat him.
I think I got every single store we stopped at. Every time someone at the fucking konbini gives me a
That's so
Nihongo
funny.
Josu.
Oh, gee.
Like, oh, Nihongo Josu. Yeah. All I said was arigato. I'm not fucking...
Yeah, and they're like,
There's
whoa,
nothing Josu about it.
amazing.
Everyone can say it. They immediately think, oh, this guy's a foreigner. He can't speak a word of Japanese. They always ask, Nihongo daijoubu? So I say like, yeah, Nihongo daijoubu.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, okay. English menu is here.
This is called gaijin treatment, which happens to many other half-Japanese I know, as well as foreign residents living here more than a decade, getting these questions all the time, which basically all implies are, you don't belong here, do you? We do treat you as a gaijin. Forever. I think that could discourage a lot, especially someone who's been studying Japanese hard and wanting to be part of the society, but frustrated. Why am I always treated as an outsider? Some people jump into the conclusion that's simply because this country is too homogeneous, as most people surrounded by the same ethnicity, or simply because Japanese are xenophobe or racist, which I don't think is necessarily true. Yes, some people may be simply racist, just like in any other country, and of course, your race or ethnicity could be a huge factor, but based on what I've seen in this country, the gaijin treatment does happen even to the ones like returnee or Japanese Americans who really seem like Japanese ethnicity-wise. So it's quite possible even if you got more Japanese features on your face, like smaller eyes or flatter nose, you might be still considered a foreigner. So it might not be just about looks or race. And let me share the possible other reasons behind it today. But before getting into that, let's get on the same page about these three. Just like in any other country, it hugely depends on the area you stay in. Urban people and rural people in Japan can be completely different. The same applies to what age group we are talking about. The younger one might be way more open-minded to a foreign culture or mindset, while the older one might be quite judgmental.
Especially the older generation in Japan who are like, unfortunately, like a little more xenophobic towards foreigners. Oh, you're just a foreigner in Japan. You don't know what it's like to live here.
And 3. This is nothing to do with whether you should behave like Japanese or not, but I'm only interested in what possibly makes someone perceived as a foreigner. Now this may be controversial to say, but I personally believe that you have the right to behave, say or do whatever you want in Japan, as long as it's not illegal in this country, and you don't cause trouble to anyone. So needless to say, you really don't want to be a dick like these foreigners. And of course, you might want to acknowledge what possibly offends people in this culture, and probably you want to study Japanese, at least enough to make a simple greeting with your neighbor. But whether you are half Japanese or foreign resident, it's not necessary or requirement to be accepted or perceived as a Japanese person. And whatever their perception may be, it's not about you, but it's about them. I think neither Joey Bizinger nor Christopher Broad may be considered as insider forever. But so what? It doesn't necessarily mean they are miserable in Japan. I think sometimes accepting that you won't be considered Japanese will make your life easier or comfortable.
If you're going to Japan with the aim of fitting in and being accepted as Japanese, it's never going to happen. It might, but it's probably never going to happen. And some people are fine with that. I'm okay with that. For me, it works, but it doesn't work for everyone.
Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the first one. To be clear, this is nothing about whether his fashion style is good or bad, unfashionable or anything like it, but it just doesn't look like a Japanese person to me. The dressing style reminds me of the college campus in the US I visited. Many of the people came dressed like pajama, which was really casual and simple. While in the college campus in Japan I used to go, all the women came with perfect makeup, heels, or fancy clothing. Even the guys dressing quite formally or presentably, which I don't think is only college campus. So someone like him could easily stand out merely based on what he puts on, like the accessories or dyed hair. And the biggest factor would be the facial hair. I know sometimes he totally shavy, but usually he got quite heavy one, and that seems really non-Japanese to us. Now you might argue that, but what about Ken Watanabe? What about Takayuki Yamada? Your country surely has many people with facial hair, right? But those are mostly celebrities like actors or entertainers, or someone regular people like me rarely have interaction with. Most people in Japan, at least in their 20s, 30s or 40s, work for companies that either require us to shave it or doesn't prohibit but socially make it inappropriate, so no one has it in the workplace. But either way, I have to say that society doesn't allow it, which is quite depressing to say, but probably this applies to both men and women. So if you're female, even wearing makeup feels like a duty to be conforming into society, not something for showing your creativity or individuality. And this is why many schools or companies impose us on a rule or regulation about hair or dressing for conformity, because we are so used to that since early age. When we see someone expressing their identity with fashion, our brain feels weird and only makes sense to us if that person is a foreigner.
The whole point of living in Japan is just kind of like, you stay in your lane, and if you try to step out, if you try to show any amount of individualism, you're kind of socially ostracized.
This is why, for example, people tend to assume having a tattoo means you are foreigner, right? Many people say it only looks natural if that's a non-Japanese person, because in their mind, Japanese people not supposed to do it.
日本人の人だったら正直ひげない方がいい。海外の人は海外の人で似合うからいいみたいな。日本人だったらそんなにかっこよく見えないんですけど、海外の人がひげをつけたらなんかかっこよく見えるんですよね。
And I think people particularly care about this, from the manner you speak, the paperwork at the bank or office, to the way you're dressing in public, and could be using that to differentiate Japanese and foreigners. Depends on the situation, but this could mean that people are more likely to trust you and see you as an insider. When I'm renting an apartment, for example, I tend to have much easier time when I wear a suit. The same goes to when I'm dealing with the police. I get trust from them more easily, and they let me go. So someone like Joe Oliver, who grew up in Japan and fluent in Japanese, he's often stopped and questioned by the police. But interestingly,
300回以上はされてきてますよね。でも僕がスーツを着てれば職務質問されないんですよ。絶対されないです。
I tend to dress a little bit nicer when I go in to sign contracts because you're judged more on your outer appearance in Japan than you are, I think, anywhere else in the world.
But the bigger reason, in my opinion, is this. So when I saw him first time, not knowing he's half Japanese, I have to say I completely assumed he must be a foreigner, even though I personally thought he looked more of an Asian than white. So racially speaking, he was actually quite familiar to me, but there's almost no similarity or relatedness I could find culturally, especially given the fact that he often speaks English on YouTube, which makes it sound quite aggressive or assertive, and probably those amplify our assumptions that he wouldn't be a Japanese. Now, to be clear, I don't think this applies to everyone, and definitely depends on the context. But I've seen that's the case with many people, including Joey Bizinger.
仲間になりたいと。その日本人なら日本人の動き方、考え方、それと似たような声を自然的にしようとするんですよね。自分の声を多少調整しないといけませんですよ。
People have told me I sound different when I speak Japanese.
Yeah.
Like I become a totally different person.
But even the language you're speaking aside, cultural connection could get you instantly be Japanese to us. For example, when I talked to this person, Rune Hoshino, who grew up in Japan, I really felt like I was talking to a native Japanese person all the time, as we could instantly get on the same page about pretty much everything, whether it's education, comedy, meme, or favorite actress we grew up with. Something that we could share and appreciate only by growing up in the same culture together. The same goes to Tiffany Rachel, who was born and raised in Japan. I was feeling exactly the same way and close a distance. So if I was blind, I wouldn't even notice it for sure. This is why someone who grew up in the States probably finds it hard to relate to anyone in Africa. So the point I've been making is that cultural one could be bigger than racial one, in a sense of what makes us feel someone's foreignness or Japaneseness.
4歳でカメルーンから日本に来ましたと、初めて。カメルーンに帰ったら自分と同じようなアフリカ系がいっぱいいるから仲間がいると思ってたんですよ、自分。で、実際カメルーンに帰ったら中身が違うんですよ。で、実際カメルーンの子供たちより日本で育ってる子たちと話してる方が話が合うんで、彼らは見た目は違うけど自分と仲間なんだなっていうことに。
Now when we think about it, Japan has been not so racially homogeneous actually, because we got people like Ainu, Ryukyuans, or people like Korean descent or Brazilian ones, and those people have been mixed and shaping this country. And what made us united or connected to each other is the culture. Of course, any culture in any country could be changing a lot with the times, but when it comes to Japan,
One thing that's making Japan so unique in this day and age is that we are so good at maintaining culture and tradition. Better than any other country.
And one thing I noticed from his video is that he's quite critical and doesn't like many stuff in Japan, whether about school uniform or the way our government handling something, which make him seem really non-Japanese.
Sexism is bad. I don't even think Korea lets this happen. Japan, in a lot of aspects, are completely missing the point.
Of course, there's nothing wrong to criticize it, but the point I want to make is that what he criticizes or focuses on is often something that many Japanese don't even bring up or question about because it's normal for them, but he does find it weird or frustrating.
I started to really think and question stuff like, wait, why do we have to take our shoes off when we enter a house? Hold on, why do we bow to everybody?
One reason why he feels like complaining would be that, as someone who's lived in more than 2 countries, often makes a comparison about pretty much everything. And those criticizing Japan based on that kind of comparison could easily stand out or even get weirded out. This is why someone who came back to Japan often feels weird, uncomfortable, and even ostracized at school as a gaijin. I guess this may be nothing weird in any other country, but in Japan, many people feel that shouldn't happen. Though Japan actually has quite many people having dual nationality or identity. A common assumption I often hear is that, いや、日本人か外人どっちかしかないでしょ。その中間はないよ。だって法律でダメって言ってんじゃん。So it might be quite hard for the Japanese to even imagine or acknowledge someone who has 2 identity and criticizing the country based on the comparison like the Joy Bizinger does. And number 3, I'm sure this is something that many people disagree with. Japan is a country of anime, and people must be so into it, right? I think many people definitely. But the question is, would they express it or disclose it openly? Now, isn't it weird? While we see many Western anime YouTubers nowadays, it's not so common to see Japanese anitubers. Aside from the anime man, I really don't think Japan has any stigma against anyone just watching or talking about anime. But I do think Japan does against otaku. I still see many people associate to nerdiness, bad looks, mental illness, or even criminality. So make it easier to understand and put it simply, people see them like incel in the West. That's how the image has been so bad in Japan. Even though anime like Kimetsu no Yaiba has been consumed a lot in this country, still only few of us actively disclose that passion because they know that they would be perceived negatively or possibly seen as a potential criminal, which I find really weird because at least based on my experience, Japanese otaku are nothing like it actually. It's totally different from a person our media describing. So when you say you are otaku, people in Japan would react like 全然オタクに見えないけどね.
The stereotypical like otaku in Japan, like you don't see people like that anymore.
It's quite ironic, isn't it? Japan is the country that created anime to begin with, but the country stigmatized the one who passionate about it. Anyway, my point is this. We may have many otaku, but they would be hiding the passion. In contrast to that, what about Western ones? I don't think they are so invisible. I see many of them not hesitate to claim that they're into anime, which totally makes sense given the rising popularity of anime in the West. And that would be part of the the reason why he got so famous and successful. More and more people in Western countries recognize a person like him. Anyway, from a Japanese perspective, when I see someone into anime and expressing the passion openly, it feels like he's not Japanese but more like weeb, even if the person was completely Asian. Because in my mind, Japanese people wouldn't have the courage to be expressing like that.
Anime otakus in Japan aren't viewed in like a positive light.
Like anime loving otakus are like, ew, sweaty, gross. And then meanwhile, if there's a guy rocking up with like full on like, you know, idols shit, and just like, oh, he just really likes idols.
Like I said, you don't have to change the way you behave or speak. But just to be aware that these may gonna change or affect their perception about you in Japan. Of course, I could be totally wrong on this. So let me know your thoughts in the comment below. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one.